All right, let's start this up. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar. Special welcome to our guest of today, Dr. Shikaki, who I will be introducing shortly. My name is Jos Hummelen. I work with CD or at CD. This video is on demand available if you want to share it later to everybody. We already have our callers calling for this video, but it will be available in a couple of hours. This is our 5th lecture. The other lectures are already available on YouTube. This can only be done through the Friends of CD and the donors. So if you are one of them, thank you so much for donating to CD so that we can do this important work. And if you're thinking about becoming a donor or a friend, you're very welcome, of course. This webinar, you can ask your questions. You can ask your questions if you're following it through Zoom, through a button that's below. If you're following it through Facebook, you can ask your questions in the comments section. First, I'll have a question for you. So please answer this on one of those two places. What is your native tongue? What is your mother tongue? And secondly, what is your age? How old are you? We'll be doing a little survey here. Because our guest of today, Khalil Shikaki, Dr. Shikaki, is doing surveys. He's the director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. This is the institute about Palestinian opinions related to their own leadership, but also to the state of Israel. I met him in Ramallah in 2019. He struck me as the Palestinian Maurice de Hond. It doesn't mean he's the same person, nor his methods are the same, but what he does is the same. So maybe that's helpful for you to understand what he does. The trends and recent findings he presented also last year in this webinar series. But this year, it will have a special emphasis on Palestinian domestic politics and on Israeli-Palestinian relations, and vice versa. I'm personally very curious about what Palestinians think of the current Israeli government. Now Netanyahu is in the opposition banks and not the prime minister anymore. Naftali Bennett is, of course, as you know. But enough about this. I hope to see your answers. They're already coming in. I see on my left screen. So make sure you'll ask the questions. If we're done with the lecture, I'll be presenting the questions to Dr. Shikaki. And I hand the floor over to you. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. My talk today is about Israeli-Palestinian relations, but it starts with an introduction who the Palestinians are. And the focus is on the trends over the years in both the domestic side of things and on Israeli-Palestinian relations. Last year, 2021, has been a very special year for our surveys because two major events happened, one domestic and one Israeli-Palestinian, and we were able to capture the perceptions of the Palestinians regarding these two issues and to see the dynamism involved, how domestic politics affected Israeli-Palestinian relations and how Israeli-Palestinian relations have affected the domestic scene. So this interplay between these two dynamics is something that we've seen in the past, but this is the first time that we have seen them so up and close. Let me share my screen with you, where you will be able to see the full presentation. Let me say something before I start about our methods. We conduct surveys among Palestinians on a quarterly basis. We've been doing this since 1993. So every 3 months we conduct a survey and we try to maintain the trends so that we ask identical questions. Some of our surveys are conducted jointly with Israeli colleagues at the Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University and the Israel Democracy Institute. And I will be using some of those, but most of those most of the slides that you'll see are based on surveys that are done among the Palestinians only. In each survey, we ask 1,200 individuals, a representative, which is a representative sample of the Palestinian public, all the districts, rural, urban, refugee camps, and of course, all age groups and so on. Those Palestinians I'm referring to are those who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I'm not referring to Israeli Arabs who are also Palestinians or Palestinians who live in the diaspora. I'm going to begin by asking the question about who the Palestinians, and I will talk about the age groups in terms of how young the society is, its religiosity, how the society defines its goals, how it defines its most important problems, the domestic balance of power between the major political forces, and it will also show the prevailing trends today among the Palestinians regarding the discontent with the PA. This is something that we have been documenting for a long time, but last year, in addition to the two major developments that I hinted at earlier, one domestic development that happened sort of crystallized this level of discontent, the high level of discontent that I will also share with you. So let me begin by talking about the age, the education, and the access to the internet. Palestinian society is a very young society. Under 25 years of age are 60%. This is much higher than it is in Israel or in Europe or the United States. Most Palestinians receive early education. Literacy rate is very high, and they go on to go to colleges and universities. 97% of the Palestinians are literate, slightly higher in the West Bank than in the Gaza Strip. Today, approximately 45,000, maybe even 46,000 this year, graduate from Palestinian universities throughout the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. 60% of our students in our universities are in fact females, and slightly more than 60, I think 62%. 60% of the graduates now are females. The access to mobile phones, particularly among the youth, is very high. The rate now we have now is 91% who owns smartphones, slightly more in the West Bank than in the Gaza Strip, and they rely on the internet for information. 87% use the internet every day. This is the youth in particular. 75% rely on social media. And the most important, perhaps, of all these figures is that a majority of 55% trust social media. This should be very depressing for those of you, well, many of you, I'm sure, familiar with how accurate and how much disinformation there is in social media. If Palestinian youth rely on social media for information, this is not good news. Let me move on quickly to religiosity. This is the trend over the last 14, 15 years. And it shows you the total in red, but it also shows West Bank and Gaza. There are no numbers for West Bank and Gaza, but you can see the idea here is that Gazans are much more religious than West Bankers. But secondly, while we have seen a rise in religiosity in these on the eve of the Arab Spring, we now, in the last wave, these are various waves of the Arab barometer, and this data comes from these waves. We here conduct the Arab barometer surveys for Palestine, and as you can see, the last wave was conducted in 1819, and it shows a significant drop among Palestinians in religiosity, in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it also shows that we basically never had a majority of Palestinians who defined themselves as religious. It's at best, we got very close, about 49%, 49% in Gaza. So even in Gaza, we don't have a majority that defines itself as religious. The highest we have seen in both West Bank and Gaza has been 45%. How do Palestinians define their most vital goals? Now, these are 4 goals that we, the researchers, pick. This is not an open-ended question. We basically ask people to organize the hierarchy of these priorities for them. What comes first, and so on. And as you can see, statehood, a state, independent and sovereign state for the Palestinians, remains the most vital goal. You'll see when I talk about Israeli-Palestinian relations that there's a decline in support for statehood. I'll explain later why we still have this as a top and most vital goal, despite the fact that in recent years we have seen a decline in support for a solution based on a two-state solution. The second in importance is the right of return. The right of return refugees to their homes and property inside Israel. This does not necessarily mean that those who pick this as the top priority, which is 30% of the population, want every Palestinian refugee to return to their homes and property inside Israel. This is about the principle of the right of return, a recognition of the narrative about the right of return. The third and fourth vital goals fluctuate from time to time. Sometimes this is what we currently have. There's more emphasis on having a religious society, but it could also be the opposite, with more emphasis on the creation of a democratic political system. So now the fact that only 9% under current conditions choose a democratic political system as the fourth priority does not necessarily mean that Palestinians are not in favor of democracy. To the contrary, our most recent surveys, including the most recent Arab barometer, which has not, I haven't yet used in this survey because we have not yet released the data, shows that close to 75% of the Palestinians believe that democracy, despite its problems, this is the language of the question, and we ask people whether they agree or disagree. Democracy, despite its problems, is the best system there is. And so we do have a significant level of support for democracy. Among the youth, the percentage is even higher. And when we ask about liberal democracy, we find among Palestinian youth a greater level of support for liberal, both social and political values. of democracy. We asked about the problems. This is from one of our surveys about 3 months ago. We asked people to, again, just to put the top priority first and so on. And in this case as well, we have selected the category of issues we presented. This is, again, is not an open-ended question. And what you currently are looking at are, again, the total for both West Bank and Gaza, as well as the division based on the West Bank and Gaza, where you also, as I've shown you with religiosity, here too, we do see in some cases significant differences in terms of occupation. Those who defined occupation as the top priority were basically almost the same in the West Bank and Gaza. About a third picked this issue. The second in importance was corruption, with about a quarter picking it. But as you can see in the West Bank, the percentage was higher than in Gaza. In part, the explanation for this is that West Bankers refer to the Palestinian Authority and the corruption within the Palestinian Authority. Gazans tend to think that Hamas's authority in Gaza is less corrupt than the Palestinian Authority. So the problem in Gaza, the second problem in Gaza, is unemployment rather than corruption, and which in the West Bank is not the second or even the third, it's the fourth, the unemployment. The unemployment rate in the Gaza Strip is close to 46% or even 47%. In the West Bank, it's closer to 18 or 19%. So this also explains the difference between the two. Finally, on this slide that you're looking at, with internal violence, you can see that in the West Bank, there's more concern about internal violence than in the Gaza Strip. In part, this has to do with the fact that in the West Bank, law enforcement, because of the divisions between A and B and C, and the inability of the Palestinian police to be able to enforce law and order in many areas because of the restrictions in agreements with the State of Israel regarding the movement of the Palestinian police, it means that there is much greater concern about safety and security, in this case, internal violence, than there is in the Gaza Strip. One of the issues that we monitor in every survey is the domestic balance of power. In this slide, you see basically three groups. The fourth group is just the undecided, which reflect three value systems. One for Fatah, which is a secular nationalist group. The other is for Hamas, which is an Islamist group. And one for third parties. Third parties are dominated by the left, who are also secularists and nationalists, but they tend to have stronger views about secularism than Fatah, which tends to be mainstream. Third parties tend to have a greater emphasis on their secularism, but third parties do not amount to much. The political system is dominated by Fatah and Hamas, and the percentages that you see for 2005 are in fact the percentages of the outcome of the elections. This is not a survey, but everything else is based on surveys. And you can see that as far as Fatah is concerned, Fatah remained relatively stable, at least in the early years. There were some ups and downs and then stable. Hamas have seen a greater fluctuations. The reason why Hamas saw a lot of fluctuations has to do with the fact that Hamas went to wars, various wars, 4 wars with Israel. The last war is not included. There will be a separate slide for that. You'll see in a minute. But this slide shows that every time there was a war, take for example 2012, this is one of the wars, and you can see the rise in support for Hamas from 29 to 36. In 14, there was another war, and you can see the spike as well, this time from 30 to 39%. And you will see later on something even greater with regard to the May 2021 war. This is one of those places where this issue, where Israeli-Palestinian relations have dramatic consequences for the domestic side of things. However, as you can look, as you look at this, what do you see? You see a spike. Then a year later, you see that things reverted back to where they were before. It happened twice here, and although sometimes it takes a longer time, but for the most part, it is about a year before things go back, which indicates that the spike in support for Hamas is essentially emotional, and it reflects the high emotional feelings that people have during conflicts and bloodshed. Remember what I said earlier about secularism? Well, most of the Palestinian society is in fact secularist, but it does allow for significant flexibility regarding religious norms, and with the exception of the left, which of course is, as I said earlier, had a definition of secularism that is more hardcore than we see among the mainstream. But that limits the ceiling of the left or the third parties. It means as long as they maintain this hardcore view about secularism and the need to separate state and religion so in a very, very effective and determined manner, it means their ability to be able to win hearts and minds remain relatively limited. One example, I mentioned earlier, the extent to which there is discontent. You can see the discontent. I could have selected any other slide to show you. For example, we have seen significant increase. Last year, for example, the range in terms of percentage, but of those who demanded the resignation of the President Mahmoud Abbas, has been somewhere between 70 to 80%. And that also reflects this level of discontent that we have, but it's also the discontent with the political system, with most Palestinians believe that the system is not a democracy, that there must be elections, that there must be free press. When asked to evaluate the status of democracy and free press, only 20 to 25% of Palestinians say we have free press or we have a democracy. In the slide I'm showing you right now, this is about the killing of a Palestinian political activist who used YouTube, his own YouTube channel, to express the frustration of the youth in particular. He was a young person, and his death at the hands of the Palestinian security services, when he was arrested, he was beaten to death, essentially, has led to a great deal of opposition and demonstrations in the street. And one of the demands of the demonstrators as you see in the question, was for the departure of the president and the departure of the government, basically regime change, something similar to what the Arab Spring chant was when it first started in 2011. And as you can see, 63% of the population in Gaza, it's in fact 66%, who demanded this regime change, supported the demand of the demonstrators. And this basically shows that a considerable majority of the Palestinian public is unhappy with the political system. Shifting back to Israeli-Palestinian, now shifting to Israeli-Palestinian relations. What do we see here? We see a consistent decline in support for compromise and the two-state solution. But we also see that this change is reversible. In a minute, I'll explain why. We see a gradual increase in support for violence, but we still see a slim majority opposed to violence and viewing it as ineffective in ending Israeli occupation. The status quo is seen detrimental to Palestinian efforts to end the occupation. The internationalization of the conflict, although I'm not going to show you, I don't think I'll have time to show all these slides, but I'll do my best to show as much as I can. And you'll see a consensus on rejecting the Trump plan. This is the most recent plan that has been submitted. The support for the Clinton parameters, if you recall, the Clinton parameters were proposed back in 2000. And over the years, we've been asking about it. And there were times in which we had a majority in favor of it. Sometimes we did not have a majority in favor. For the Trump plan, there was a consensus on rejecting it. I'll show you the slides, and I'll show you why there was such a consensus on rejecting it. This shows the last decade or so of support for the two-state solution and the support for the competing idea. The competing idea is one democratic state in which in the entire land between the river and the sea, where Palestinians and Israeli Jews would live together in one political system and would have equal rights. One person, one vote. For the Palestinians, this is something, a change that they see that needs to happen in a similar way to what happened in South Africa with the end of apartheid. Now, if you look at where we started 10 years ago, now if I were to take you 20 years back, the gap, of course, would be way greater. Where in the mid-90s, for example, support for the two-state solution was higher than 80%, and support for the one-state solution was just 5 to 10%. But the last decade in particular, we have seen a significant increase. During the second intifada, a lot of that increase for the one-state solution came, but the decline in support for the two-state solution started a little earlier, but it accelerated during the period that we are looking at right now. And what you're looking at now is the average per year, because we asked this question 4 times every year, and you're looking at the average at that time. Here I'm stopping at 2020, and in 2020, so about 2 years ago, we basically had the two almost meeting. We haven't done that yet, even today. And in a minute, actually, I'll show you now. These are 2 separate questions that you are now looking at. So this is a question about support for the two-state solution. And then and people can say yes or no, we support it or oppose it. And then we ask, well, what about this idea? So we are in the answer to the question about the one-state solution or the two-state solution, there would be a lot of overlap. People who might have said they support a two-state solution, might have also said that they support a one-state solution. How do we know that? Well, we can easily know that by cross-tabulating the results, but there is another way in which we know that, and that is when we confront people with the two options and force them to choose between one or the other. Where do people go when confronted with this? This is what happens when we confront people. And this is one of the recent surveys that we've conducted. So this is about 6 months ago. And it shows that the support for the two-state solution, sorry, the one I'm going to show you is actually this one. This is where they basically have 3 choices. The one-state solution is presented in 2 separate ways. One is conceptual, just equal rights, and the other is by example. The way Israeli Arabs, who are also Palestinians, who live in the state of Israel and have Israeli citizenship. So people could opt for a one-state solution, either with equal rights to Jews and Arabs, or to the status of Israeli Arabs. And of course, they can select the two-state solution. And then, of course, they can say, we don't like any of those. As you can see, those who said they don't like any of this, and those who said they support a two-state solution are almost equal. And those who picked the one-state solution in its 2 variants have a less than 30%, 27% to be precise. Slightly higher in the West Bank than in the Gaza Strip, but the findings are basically similar to in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Now, who are the others? Well, we have people who, for example, support one single state for Palestinians only, where Israeli Jews can be second-class citizens, or in fact are not part of the state. And there are people who will say they will support a confederation between 2 states, the state of Palestine, or some sort of federation. And so among the others, this is not one particular view, but various views. Those, however, the majority of those others are, the majority in this case would be approximately 25% of all Palestinians. The 25%, less than those who selected a two-state, less than those who selected a one-state with equal rights, would say one single state, but the Palestinians would be dominant in that political system. How do we end Israeli occupation? This is one of the issues that we have been tracking for a long time. People can say negotiations. They can say nonviolence, and they can say armed struggle. Now, this is an important slide in terms of explaining what is happening. Why do we see, for example, you're looking at September 20, where the support for armed struggle was high. It's not the highest in this slide, but it was relatively high, 41%. What was this support in the mid-90s? Just 18%. So 18% in 1995-96. We then had the second intifada in 2000, and for 4 years, the percentage was in the 60s or 70s. And then starting in 2005, we have seen significant decline in support for violence or armed struggle until 2015-16, when we started to see a rise, but never a majority. Even in this slide, as you look at this there is really no majority, even when things worsened significantly. There was a split among the almost equal, but a split nonetheless. So when was the period, the one that is you see encircled in red? This is the period where the support for negotiations and the support for armed struggle were almost equal. This is actually very good news. This is the period in which we've seen a decline in support for armed struggle and a rise in support for diplomacy and negotiations. This is March 2021. Why do we see this happening? Why is March important? Well, March is important because this was the time when Palestinians believed that they were going to elections. I'll talk more about this in a minute. But then look at what happens 3 months later, right here, June 21, we see a spike in support for violence, and we see significant decline in support for negotiations. What happened? May happened, May 2021, and the violence and the war between Hamas and Israel. So this is the spike that have led to this. As I said, I'll talk a little bit more about this as we proceed, but I'm trying now to just to finalize the Israeli, how Palestinians view relations with Israel in terms of support for the two-state solution, support for violence, and now support for a package that ends the conflict, the Trump plan. Over the years, we have presented the Palestinians with essentially two plans. This Trump plan, which was presented soon after it was announced, and it was announced in January 2020. This is February 2020. And the Clinton parameters. The Clinton parameters are also a very detailed plan that was, as I said earlier, was presented in 2000. The Trump plan, the Clinton parameters received the support of close to 60% at times, 40% at other times. 40% are the more recent findings. 60% are basically 2007, 2008, when the Palestinian president was negotiating with the Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert at that time. This was a good time in terms of the optimism that prevailed and the support for compromise that our surveys have shown. But for the Trump plan, there is really no support almost whatsoever. You have, for the package, you have only 4% who supported it. And for the various items, as you can see, all of them were rejected by a majority exceeding 90%. And that basically shows that the plan was totally unacceptable. This is one reason why it was seen as totally unacceptable. When we asked Palestinians in the same survey about the chances that accepting this Trump plan would end the Israeli occupation, what are the chances? Well, 0 was picked by 58%, less than 50 was picked by 21%, 50-50 was by 10. Only those who said 100% chance or more than 50% were just 7%. And you can see this is obviously something that would be unacceptable. I know I'm running out of time, and I just have few more slides to show you. And the slides, I've already shown you some of this, but it tells you what happens domestically. When we go to war with Israel, Hamas goes to war with Israel, or there's violence among Palestinians and Israelis, support for Hamas goes up. What if we are not going to war, instead reforming our own political system, becoming more democratic, going to elections? What happens then? Well, we'll see in a minute what happens. This is a survey from June 21, which is to say this is in 1 month after the war between Hamas and Israel. And it shows very clearly that support for Hamas the slide, by the way, shows you the findings in March, 2 months before the war, and June, 1 month after the war. And as you can see, the findings are dramatic. Support for Fatah in March was 43% and Hamas 30%. This is March. This is when Palestinians were preparing to go to elections. Going to elections served Fatah, not Hamas. In fact, the percentage you see for March indicates a decline in support for Hamas and a rise in support for Fatah. But then 3 months later, the survey shows after the war that the support for Fatah declines from 43 to 30, and the support for Hamas spikes from 30% to 41%. And you can see the same when it is about presidential elections. For Abbas and Haniyeh, the findings are essentially the same. Hamas wins when there is war. Fatah wins when there is elections. When things start looking good domestically, Fatah is the one that benefits, not Hamas. Here is the slide that shows clearly this issue about going to war and going to elections. Remember what I encircled in red about support for diplomacy and violence? Well, it was here in March. And what do we see in March? We see this support for a spike from December to March. Remember what I just said earlier, that support for Hamas declined. It declined from 34 to 30 when we were about to go to elections, and increased for Fatah from 38 to 43. And then drops, as I've shown you earlier. But this slide continues to September, and it shows that in September, the support for Hamas declined from 41 to 37. So this is the reverting back to where they were before. The support for Fatah increased slightly to 32, but it did continue after that. So this linkage between Israeli-Palestinian relations and the domestic balance of power, and vice versa, is very clearly, of course, if Palestinians vote for Hamas, this affects Israeli-Palestinian relations. If Israeli-Palestinian relations worsen, Hamas benefits. Okay, my last slide is about confidence building measure. This is the new Israeli government. This is Bennett and Gantz and Lapid. I mentioned Gantz in particular because it was Gantz who started the discussion on confidence building measures with the Palestinian president. And the question is whether Palestinians find these confidence building measures good news or bad news. If Palestinians see confidence building measures as good news, then this means that Israeli-Palestinian relations will significantly improve. Support for diplomacy would go up and support for violence would go down. I'm not going to show you all the slides because I've ran out of time, but I'll show you what I started with. How do Palestinians view confidence building measures with support? And this is a survey that was done in September. This is September 2001. We have done a survey actually after that, and these figures were confirmed. Not only confirmed, in fact, as you can see, the total who said they look positively at confidence building measures increased from 55 to 62%. That is a very important development because it means that the actual implementation of the confidence building measures have actually contributed to creating a much better environment in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Okay, so since this is the most positive, the most optimistic slide, it's perhaps time that I stop and take your questions. I'll stop sharing my screen, but if you have any question about any of the slides, I'll be happy to come back to the slides.
All right, thank you so much so far. It's time for your questions. I received a couple of them, not an awful lot, so which is a compliment in itself, because then you're very clear. But feel free, if you're listening to this webinar, to ask your questions. You can hit the Q&A button if you're viewing on Zoom, or type your questions in the comment section on Facebook. I received a couple of questions, so let's just start with the first one. You talked about young Palestinians who rely on social media as a source of news, which is a concern in itself. Do Palestinians read the Israeli news outlets like Haaretz and Times of Israel? Is the first question.
It's a very good question. They do, because these they don't go to the Israeli media to read them. Of course, some do, but the overwhelming majority of Palestinians who read the articles, the columns in Israeli newspapers do so in Palestinian newspapers, because the articles are in fact translated the second day into Arabic, and they can see them in the Palestinian print media. The problem is not too many young Palestinians turn to print media for information, which is very problematic, because print media, those who in fact turn to print media, tend to be a lot more accurate in answering questions that we ask about accuracy. We try to see who among our respondents are more informed than others. So we ask factual questions sometimes to see who is knowledgeable about things. We cross-tabulate that with the questions about source of information. Where do they go for information? Those who go to print media tend to be the most accurate. Those who go to social media tend to be the least accurate in responding. So yes, they read the Israeli articles, but the number is much smaller than one would hope for if these articles are available on social media as well.
Second question is about the Gaza Strip and your methods. How do you make sure people in the Gaza Strip feel free to answer the questions as they like?
Two ways. One, of course, is by training our field workers and making sure that they can assure people of total anonymity and confidentiality. This is something that we focus on a lot, and we don't take names or addresses of respondents. So the minute we leave the house, there's no trace of who said what. This is one way of doing it. Total anonymity gives people the freedom to whisper in our ears without having to worry about the consequences. But secondly, we for both the West Bank and Gaza, we are always concerned about people not being truthful or fearful of giving their true views. And we ask questions to figure out this is what we call fear factor. We want to measure the fear factor. We want to see the difference in West Bank versus Gaza in this regard. And we also want to know how to correct for that. And of course, we want to see the trend over the years. So one of the ways we do that, which is used in our surveys in Israel and elsewhere, is to ask people about their vote in the last elections they participated in. and then compare the findings for their district with the actual findings of the elections, and then reweighting the data so that the answer to the question about how they voted becomes accurate. We therefore correct answers, and using our software, which is SPSS for those interested, SPSS then can reweight the data for everything else, including how will you vote in the next elections. As I've shown you, the questions about political affiliation and support and so on, or general attitudes. Do you support this or that, support for armed struggle versus support for diplomacy and so on. So all these things are then affected by the reweighting. So what do we find? Is there a great deal of fear? The answer is no. There is some fear, but it's not a big issue. It is bigger in Gaza than it is in the West Bank, because this is what we also expected. The ability of respondents to express their views seems to be stronger in the West Bank than it is in the Gaza Strip. And over the years, in fact, and of course, this gap between what actually happens, as in the case of elections, and what people tell us narrows occasionally, and we can see why this is happening. And it's usually when there is an opening in the political system, when people are emboldened by something like the Arab Spring, for example, where in fact we saw a lot more accurate responses to questions about previous voting behavior. And so these are the ways that we rely on in order to make sure that we have control over this issue of fear factor. We cannot eliminate it completely, but we can monitor it, and we can, through the reweighting, help to basically restore some truthfulness to the responses of our sample.
That's very clear, I think. Thank you. The third question, do you have the idea that Hamas wages war precisely because they gain popularity among Palestinians?
You mean that it decides to go to war because it wants this popularity? What to do with the popularity is a good question. We have seen, let's take the May War. Why did Hamas go to war in May 2021? This is a hypothesis. I don't have evidence. My hypothesis is that Hamas decided to go to war not seeking popularity, but seeking to punish the Palestinian Authority and Abbas for canceling the elections. Palestinian elections were canceled in April. So in March, when we went to the field, the prevailing perception of the public was there will be elections, and people were optimistic about it. And this reflected itself in the change in the pattern of electoral behavior. Then a month later, the Palestinian Authority decided to cancel the elections. Immediately after the Palestinian Authority decided that, Hamas's behavior changed. Hamas became a lot more antagonistic. There were many occasions in the past in which there was turmoil and clashes and attempts by Israeli right-wingers to change the status quo in holy places in East Jerusalem. None of that in the past led to war between Hamas and Israel. This time it did. The reason for that, I believe, it was Hamas's decision that in the absence of elections that has been driven by the needs of Abbas, Hamas was going to punish the PA. And it wanted to show that it is more popular than the PI, and that this is why the PI canceled the elections, because of its fear that that it would lose the elections. So, in other words, what I'm saying is, if the Palestinian Authority did not cancel the elections, there would not have been a war in May 2021.
I think this is a rather not really unique, but a strong viewing point, which is very interesting. You've written an 8-page PDF about this, about what the Hamas-Israel war in May means for the future, and also about the democratic state of the future Palestinian state. If you are listening to this and you want to read it, I'd recommend it. You can send an email to me, that is j.hummelen@cd.nl. In the poll, you said most of you speak Dutch, so my name is Jos Hummelen, so j.hummelen@cd.nl, and I'll send you that PDF. Thanks for answering the question. Another one is, you talked about in the end about confidence building measures. What measures actually work?
One of the most important measures that the Palestinian Authority, the PA president, and the Israeli Defense Minister Gantz have agreed to was to normalize the status of many Palestinians who have lost their IDs or were denied by Israel the ability to have an ID. For those of you who are listening to me, and you might not know that Israel controls the issuing of personal IDs and passports to Palestinians, Israel, in fact, continues to control the civil register of the Palestinian Authority completely in the hands of the State of Israel. And it can therefore deny you an ID, and you would become basically stateless, and you have no ability to travel. And if you do not have an ID, you can be arrested at Israeli checkpoints and so on. Thousands and thousands of Palestinians, probably close to 25,000 Palestinians today, did not have IDs. And in the past few months, the State of Israel has granted many of those. I don't have the latest figures, but I would say close to 10,000 have now been given such IDs. This has been a very, very popular confidence building measure. There are other things that the two sides have been working on. Perhaps the second most effective have been the ability of Israel, the decision by Israel to allow the PA to have access to more financial resources. These are Palestinian resources that the State of Israel was withholding. And the defense minister agreed to transfer hundreds of thousands of shekels to the Palestinian treasury, which allowed it to pay salaries in full, although today it still cannot do that. But certainly anything financial, anything that would improve conditions would be highly effective, and this has been. However, ultimately, the ability of the Palestinians to have much greater freedom of movement, the ability to build in Area C. The State of Israel keeps demolishing homes that are and businesses that are built in Area C without permits. The State of Israel does not issue permits for Palestinians who live in Area C. One of the confidence building measures has been that Israel has agreed to grant Palestinians some permits, very, very small number, about 1,000 or so, when in fact tens of thousands are needed. This is one area where a lot more can be done, and it would have very significant economic benefits to the Palestinians if it is done. So of course, there are a lot of other things that I can go on, including the ability of the Palestinian police and security services to travel freely without having to coordinate their movement on roads, so that they can be able to reach most, if not all, towns and villages where there is crime or threats to security and safety. Transfer of control over areas in implementation of existing agreements. In Area C, according to the Oslo Agreement, is supposed to become Palestinian territory and should have been by 1999 fully under Palestinian control. And this has not happened. So any transfer of territory would also have a significant positive impact as a confidence building measure.
Mm. All right, I have 4 or maybe 5 last questions. Maybe you can answer them quickly, although, of course, you're an academic. The first one is by Albert ter Harmsel. Thank you for your question, Albert. You mentioned a couple of solutions like two-state and one-state and the support for it. How much support for a solution is necessary to make this solution successful?
A majority. You need a majority of people, both on the Israeli side, by the way, and the Palestinian Authority's side. There is a commitment to send any agreement reached to a referendum. And you need a majority for that to pass. So we need a majority of Palestinians and Israelis to support a two-state solution so that when one is reached and people are asked to support it or oppose it, those in favor would be greater than those in opposition.
Right. Is there any support for a three-state solution, Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel?
Not among Palestinians, no. We do not see, for the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, the unification of the West Bank and Gaza is seen as essential for any solution to the conflict. The idea of the West Bank or Gaza being separated from each other is totally unacceptable to the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian public. We've never seen any Palestinian in our surveys who have said that they would rather keep Gaza and the West Bank separate.
All right. Do Palestinians feel betrayed by the Arab states as the latter signed the Abraham Accords?
Absolutely. The overwhelming majority, in fact, when the Abraham Accords were signed, the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian public said this is an indication of Arab abandonment. So there is absolutely no doubt that Palestinians believe that Arab normalization should not precede Palestinian-Israeli peacemaking, and that the correct manner of normalization should be for peace between Palestinians and Israelis, the creation of a Palestinian state first, and then Arab normalization.
Another question by Albert ter Harmsel. Would Palestinians accept a Jewish minority in their future state?
If in peace, yes, but not settlers. The reputation of settlers is one that is very damaging to Israeli-Palestinian relations. But for Palestinians, Jews can live in the Palestinian state, in a future Palestinian state, under Palestinian sovereignty, just like Palestinians or Israeli Arabs live in the state of Israel under Israeli sovereignty.
Last question. What hopeful message can we get out of this webinar?
That things are really bad, but they can nonetheless be improved. We've seen that confidence building measures, in fact, have helped to reduce the support for violence, increase the support for diplomacy, increase the support for secular nationalists among the Palestinians. In previous survey experiments we've conducted jointly with colleagues at Tel Aviv University, we have found that with the right incentives, we can significantly reduce the level of opposition to compromise between the two sides.
All right, then I think I was just checking, but I think we answered all the questions. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Shikaki. And you who followed this lecture, a special shout out to my colleague who organized this whole series. It's Rebecca Heijs. I mean, it's not a Brit. She's not a Brit. Next week we'll be back with an important lecture about Israel and the international law. I'm looking forward to see you all again. In the meantime, for the people who said they speak Dutch in my little poll in the beginning, we hebben een podcast over de geschiedenis en geopolitiek van Israël in het Midden-Oosten. Die kun je gewoon vinden als je zoekt op je favoriete podcast-app, zoals Spotify. Het heet Mizrach, dat is M-I-Z-R-A-C-H, Mizrach. Zoek me even op. We hebben er alweer 16 gemaakt, dus abonneer je meteen en laat ons weten wat je ervan vindt. Mizrach. Thank you all again. Till next week, same time, same place. And thank you very much again, Dr. Shikaki.
Thank you.